3 days in July 1863, the fields of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, erupted with one of the fiercest battles of the Civil War. More than 50,000 soldiers died, were wounded, or went missing in action as the Union Army repelled Confederate invaders from the South. 48% of Union soldiers and 69% of Confederate soldiers were farmers. They returned to an industry that was forever changed by the Civil War. The farms around Gettysburg served as hospitals, makeshift cemeteries, staging grounds, and battle sites. 2,000 acres of the Gettysburg battlefield still operate as active farms. Today, veteran Colonel Kevin Farrell and his colleagues Jim and Chuck will serve as our tour guides throughout the location of this historic battle.
I'm here at Gettysburg with 8 distinguished military veteran farmers. Together, we're exploring key leadership moments from that historic event that will resonate with them today to help them get better at what they do. So we are on McPherson's Ridge, just northwest of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Not far from this spot and this rolling terrain to our front is where Brigadier General John Buford made a fateful decision. He and his 2,700 cavalrymen decided to defend this ground against Confederate attackers. In so doing, they set in motion a series of events that would lead to the greatest battle ever to take place in the continent of North America. This is where the battle started, and that's exactly why we're at this location. You can imagine 7:30 in the morning on July 1st of 1863, John Buford and his cavalry division are going to make some key decisions here and defend this ground. That's South Mountain. That's part of the Blue Ridge mountain chain. It's actually part of the Appalachians, and that is a protective barrier. So they've made that long march of hundreds of miles on the far side of that mountain range. From a military perspective, why would rolling terrain that's open be described as good ground, do you think?
It's difficult, of course, to march up the hill into oncoming fire. It gives you that observation that their senior leaders can see what's happening before them and direct their various units around.
Exactly. Cemetery Hill is that key terrain, the decisive terrain that is going to determine the control of Gettysburg itself. If you control that high ground, even if you possess Gettysburg proper, it's going to be of little value to you because you can have indirect fire or direct fires interdicting movement through the town. Okay, so Buford understands the power of that terrain, and it's going to really govern all of the decisions that he makes in this area. He's a cavalry division commander. So what was the role of the cavalry in the Civil War?
More of a recon.
Recon, right? What does that mean?
You're there to check the terrain, you're there to check out, just kind of get everything ready for the foot troops that are coming in divisions, waves coming in later.
Okay, excellent. Was the role of the cavalry to fight? Not really, right? Why not, do you think?
Because you need to determine what you're up against and the strength of the army before you ever engage in battle.
That's right. So when they find, in fact, it's not cavalry that's here, but instead, what do they run into?
Infantry.
Infantry, that is a shock. Okay, that is a crisis moment. Anybody recall how many troops there are in Buford's organization, this division? It's roughly about 2,700. And he's going against an enemy corps, well over 20,000. What does Buford decide to do on this spot?
Hold it.
He's going to hold, right?
He's not going to find a better place.
He's not going to find a better place. What's the significant risk that he faces in defending here?
Losing that ground.
Yeah. Imagine 20,000 gray-clad and butternut Confederate troopers coming this way, and you've got 2,700 at most with one battery of artillery. I mean, this is a huge, huge risk that he's taking.
As you look at your operations, how do you think about risk, and what are your big risks that really ate at your mind and really worried you, kept you up at night?
Inputs.
The availability of inputs?
Rising interest.
cost of
Cost,
inputs.
yeah. We didn't expect that year over year. Crazy.
This is the highest costing crop that we've ever put in the ground.
You got situations where you rising crop prices, inputs always rise with them. The larger companies take advantage of that. And then what happens is that you really got to watch yourself, because what occurs is high input costs, and then guess what? Fall comes around, low crop prices.
Right.
And that cleans out the weak sisters and stuff of the farmers, and that's bad news for all of us.
You go back to 1937, the life expectancy of an S&P 500 company was about 75 years. You got established and you had a good runway. Now it's less than 15. And that's all to do with the pace of change and how quickly new people are entering the market. I mean, you've got to feel it with everything from self-driving equipment to drones to all the things that when people look at the future of farming, and some of it's actually here already, it's going to look very, very different even that it does today. And you're going to be making decisions on that on a regular basis. So that notion of how you look at yourself and the decisions that you make are critical.
Here we are at Reynolds Mound. We've just left the spot where Brigadier General John Buford made some key decisions and asked that he be relieved, he be reinforced by the troops under the command of Major General John Reynolds. So Buford has done his duty, he's given the information, and he has relinquished command, if you will, to John Reynolds. Now, Reynolds is not just a corps commander at this point, he is the acting commander of the entire Army. He had been designated a wing commander, and he's in charge of the whole force that's here on the field. So not just his normal unit, but he has been temporarily elevated into a higher level of command. And what does he do? After receiving an overview of what the situation is on the ground, he leaves the cupola and proceeds all the way forward to the front line where we're standing right now. Mind you, Confederate troops are maybe 60 to 70 yards just from where we stand now, the other side of these woods. This is the front edge of the battle line. And he comes forward, and the unit that is here is the so-called Black Hat Brigade. This is the Iron Brigade. Even though they were volunteers, they were considered to be the equal of regulars. Probably the best unit in all of the Union Army that's here on the field at this time. Reynolds is giving instructions. He's on his horseback in this spot. He turns back, gives instructions to a captain to rush reinforcements forward into the line, and as he's doing so, he takes a round in the back of the head, and he's probably dead before he hits the ground. My question for you is, what do you think he was doing in this spot? Why had this general officer, two-star general, come all the way forward into the front lines to give directions to a captain at this spot in the line?
Reading General Powell's memos on some things, where in the battlefield should the leader be? That's always your biggest question that you need to answer and be properly positioned. Either at the farm or in a battle. Why was the general up here 60 yards from the front line? That's poor generalship.
You nailed it. We have a shorthand phrase. We'll often describe that concept you referenced back to General Powell. In battlefield leadership, we'll often talk about the location of a leader. Are you where you should be given your current role and responsibility? What led him to make that bad decision, do you think? Just let me emphasize, this is his best unit. This is his absolute best unit in the entire organization. Out of many thousands, he's coming to his best unit.
Sounds like a bad choice.
Overconfidence, maybe.
Overconfidence?
Well, obviously it was a bad choice.
Well, if you pay for it with your life. Don't want, certainly, I mean, let's talk a little bit about his reputation. Because Reynolds was regarded, justifiably so, as the best fighting general in the Union Army. Where the fighting was thickest, that's where you would expect him to be. He would rush to the sound of the guns. Where did Buford command the battle from? Back in the cupola. What type of ammunition did muskets fire in these days? Black powder, right? The black powder. What happens when you fire a black powder musket?
Smoke.
Big cloud of smoke. What happens when you fire thousands of rounds of black powder muskets? Lots and lots of smoke, meaning that our visibility from this spot might be to that fence to your rear and maybe to that monument to your front. Buford commanded back in the cupola. Reynolds comes forward to this spot. The enemy is 60 yards away. His visibility, i.e. what he's able to influence, control, and see, is just a few dozen yards in either direction. Ask yourself, am I positioning myself where I should be given my current roles or responsibility, especially when the situation is ambiguous?
General Reynolds came to his comfort zone. You know, the battle, you can imagine the adrenaline and the emotion. He came to his comfort zone. So Scott, you mentioned you have folks on your team. Do you let them consciously always go to their comfort zone?
That's something people need to learn. That's a leadership skill that's taught, I figured out. When you're moving pigs, you have 4 people moving pigs from weaning the sow and getting the pigs on a trailer, and you have 4 people at it. Well, the leader needs to be at the right position to make sure everybody's operating effectively and getting the pigs where they need to go. They can't just be at the crate pushing pigs out. They have to be properly situated to see the whole situation and make sure you're actually looking out for the welfare of the pigs as you're moving them.
You know, General Reynolds, he jumped his chain of command. There's a chain of command for a reason. Just like we have people back at our operations, they're designed to deliver a tender or do, the invoicing or whatever the case may be. Just like General Reynolds kind of went back to his comfort zone. My comfort zone is jumping in a truck and getting out there and delivering something, but I need to stay back, have like the cupola effect, and watch my operation from that standpoint.
One of the points I took away from this was when General Buford was up in the tower, he was able to assess the situation better from his vantage point, picking the right people for the right job, finding people's strengths, letting them do what they do, letting them use those strengths. I have a gentleman that works for me. He's my truck driver. I don't have to worry about him. It's great because I can call him a couple of times a day, say, hey, this is what we got going on, give him a list of names, these are our customers. He goes out and gets it done. I don't have to worry about the truck. He'll might call me, say, we're getting close to a service or something like that, but I can be pretty much hands off with him, and it works good for both of us. He doesn't want to be micromanaged, and I don't have to micromanage him.
So this concludes really our discussion of what happened when General Reynolds arrived on the battlefield. Outstanding. From here, we're going to move north to Oak Hill and address the situation from the perspective of General Lee. What is going on with the Army of Northern Virginia and what options are available to him? Okay, so here we are on top of Oak Hill. It was near this very spot, somewhere early in the afternoon on July 1st of 1863, that Robert E. Lee would have arrived on the battlefield. You can imagine his dismay when he showed up here to find a full-scale battle well underway. This was contrary to his explicit orders. He did not want the battle to get underway until he had all of the conditions set. If you recall, really big picture, he had 3 infantry corps. An infantry corps would be over 20,000 men in each. One of them had gone way up to the north, all the way to Harrisburg in York. It would have been hooking down to the south. The other under A.P. Hill is the one that started that attack too soon. And that 3rd Infantry Corps under James Longstreet would have been bringing up the rear. Again, another 20,000+ men in that formation. So I want to ask you, Lee comes to this location and he finds that the battle has gotten well underway against his explicit orders. What is he to do? What options does he have as a commander?
He can advance or retreat,
right.
Essentially.
He can press the attack or he can retreat. Robert E. Lee was very connected. He was very decisive. And we like to liken this spot here almost to a crisis situation. But in that crisis, he sees an opportunity. Remember why we've come north into Pennsylvania?
To meet the army and destroy it.
We want to win the war. So is it possible then for Lee, despite it not being a perfect situation, is it possible for him to achieve that end state, the very reason why he's come north?
Yes.
When you're presented with a crisis, are you able to adjust course and really press home to find that opportunity for ultimate success after all?
So the obvious connection, you had your Lee moment here last couple of years with COVID. So how did COVID change your plan?
The fog of war is on both sides, and it can make opportunity for you. So same in ag. I look for opportunities whenever things are in chaos and everything upside down. Grain prices flying in one direction, interest rates swinging way down. We were down to 3% for a while. We grabbed onto that stuff. So whenever there's it's huge fluctuations and all this turmoil, there's opportunity there.
One of the terms that we always talk about, and it affects business just like it affects a battle, is this thing called ROL. Now, if I asked you what ROI was, most of you would know what that means, right? Return on investment. ROL is return on luck. We have it all the time in business. You have it all the time in farming. It's things out of your control. Sometimes it's good luck. Sometimes it's bad luck. The return on luck has less to do with the event and more to do with the individuals making decisions about what they're going to do with it. So we're talking about being opportunistic and going like, wait a minute, interest rates are down, this is happening, this is a time to buy, go get, where other people may immediately retrench and become very, very cautious. They get very low return on luck. Imagine for a minute being the CEO of Perel Company when the pandemic hits, right? The hand sanitizer company. You can't find it anywhere. Prices are getting jacked up. You would automatically assume that that must have been the best year in the history of the company. And it may have been, but it's no guarantee that just because you have good luck, you're going to get a high return on luck. And there's no reason that because bad luck comes your way that it can't be turned into opportunity, but it has to do with the leadership agility the people running it have to take advantage of it, to see it differently, to look at it in a different way. And that's what Lee runs into here. He has no plan on all of a sudden having a superiority on the field. It just happens. The question we'll answer at the next stop is, does he have a high return on that good luck or not? And if he doesn't, why?
This last couple of days I've really enjoyed it. I've watched what these generals were thinking and doing to see what was by chance and what they actually planned. And I see more chance as I watch this. The biggest thing I caught was the deal where Lee shows up and the battle's already going. And instead of going, let's pull back and start over, I wasn't here, he looks at what's going on and goes, you know what, this isn't too bad. Let's go with it. And that probably what the most impressed with what I learned while I was here.
Okay, so we have just finished the discussion here on Oak Hill about the options open to Lee. He's going to press the attack. What we need to figure out is, how did he fall into this mess in the first place? Where was Jeb Stuart? Okay, let's go. Behind you, you can see a beautiful example of fencing, split rail fencing that the locals referred to as cow high and hog tight. So kind of an authentic period recreation here. But I want to pick up the narrative and ask, where was Jeb Stuart? Why was Lee's vaunted cavalry officer missing in action? Where was he? What was he up to? You might be surprised to learn that Jeb Stuart is arguably one of the finest cavalry commanders in the history of the United States. He was that good, but he was also very much a showman. And he asked Robert E. Lee for permission to conduct one of his famous ride-arounds. He's done this twice before. It's where he would do a 360 loop around the enemy army for the purpose, maybe capturing supplies, cutting telegraph lines, maybe a few prisoners, that type of thing. He asked Lee for permission to do this. Lee grants it on two conditions. One, once he finds that Union army, send back word where it was. And second, once that Union army starts moving north, come back immediately. Well, here's why he was missing at Gettysburg. He's doing the 360 ride around. That Union army started moving north. He was on the wrong side of 92,000 federal troops. He physically could not get back in time. This presents a real challenge for Lee, because Jeb Stuart's peers, his other corps commanders, these three infantry corps commanders, were quite furious that he was absent. And they blamed really the predicament that the Confederate Army was in on his absence. But Lee needs him, he needs him fully in the fight. And if this action goes unpunished, Jeb Stuart's peers, their morale will be low. But if Lee punishes him too severely, well, in that case, he'll lose the great capability. And this reminds me of a phrase some of you might remember from your military days: never walk past a discrepancy. Why do we never want to walk past the discrepancy? What do we do when we see something wrong and we as leaders don't take an action to correct it?
Shows compliance.
You normalize it.
Rewards bad behavior, we normalize it. We've established a new lower standard.
One of the key points that Kevin talked about was never walk past a discrepancy. And I thought about applying that to my farm. We have a 2,000 sow farrow to finish farm and a 2,500 sow farrow to wean operation. The public expects us to treat our animals well. So if I allow that, then it's tacit approval that animals can be mistreated. So don't walk past a discrepancy. People think you're anal or whatever, but let them think that. You've got to pay attention to detail, and you have to expect excellence.
Okay, here we are at the Eternal Peace Monument. This is a remarkable memorial. It was dedicated on July 3rd of 1938. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt presided over the events. About 250,000 people would have been in the valley. Now this commemorates the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. I like to suggest that monuments say a lot more about the time during which they are dedicated as much about the events that they themselves commemorate. What was going on in the world in 1938?
Hitler.
Right, Adolf Hitler was in charge in Nazi Germany. He had just completed the Anschluss. What was Japan up to in the Pacific?
They're game planning.
They're in a full-fledged war in mainland China. So in other words, the horizon for the United States was cloudy, to put it mildly. And I'd like to think of this monument as much a symbol of national unity going forward into a troubled world, as much it was a very moving commemoration of the battle that was fought here 75 years before its dedication.
In your teams on the farm, do you have a method of recognizing your team members year in, year out? And if you do, what's that look like?
We give a financial bonus when planting of corn is complete. That way we're all focused on certain items that year, and for a row crop farm, probably for us it's most important.
At my farm, I always think pigs, people, and profits. And so I like to go around and recognize individually, just one-on-one talking when I hear somebody doing a good job. And I just like to verbally spend time with them and just let them know how much I noticed that they did a good job. Reward the behavior that you like to see.
Cohesion, building a team, is the essence of getting things done and staying together. Letting people know that you care, letting them know that they're valued members of the team. That's why they'll dig down and work that extra mile for you. Okay, so right now we're standing atop Cemetery Hill. This location received its name for the cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery you see over there, founded in 1854. Lee has given Ewell, a new Corps commander, one of his 3 principal ground force commanders, the order to take Cemetery Hill, this location, if practicable. It's important to remember that Ewell is relatively new to his job. He's been out of action for about a year. He was severely wounded the year prior. He lost his leg to his hip. He's never been in this type of judgment call situation in the past. And long story short, he does nothing. He waits at near Barlow Knoll where we were earlier, and he doesn't issue orders to attack. He doesn't issue orders to defend. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't report higher. And we can consider a number of things that take place here. Lee has a new member of his command, a new member of the team, and yet he treats the organization like it's the old team. Lee thinks he's being very clear. He's talking in the way that he would have talked to any of his trusted subordinates. Ewell's never been in this conversation before, and what he hears is confusing to him.
Anytime you have a new person in your business, you have a new team. So how do you bring that new person up to speed and bring him into the family?
We've talked a lot about standard operating procedures in our little business, which is ironic because it is mostly family, and it makes my brother roll his eyes at me. But the idea that we have a standard operating procedure, whether it's a piece of paper in each tractor that is laminated that says these are the steps for X, Y, or Z, or something that we actually sit down and discuss with new employees, it's something that we're trying to implement, but I don't know that we're there yet.
I think it goes back to like leadership by example. There's a lot of times when we say you shouldn't rush to the front lines, but there's other times where you have to show the why so they understand how and why we do things. So how to handle the equipment, the protocols that are in place so they understand the importance to have the mission get complete.
There's a pretty significant difference between succession planning and succession readiness. Succession planning is, well, if this happens, this person's going to go here and that person, and you got a plan in place. Succession readiness is, what are you doing to ensure that if that happens, that person is actually ready? And usually that takes concerted effort on your part as the leader to sit and make sure they get the series of experiences that they need so that when they go in there, they have the best chance. It's not a guarantee, but they have the best chance of being successful.
Succession planning is one of the hardest things that farms do, and I can't stand here and act like I'm an expert of it. Our own succession planning was difficult, and there were times that my brother and I were angry about it. We're like, you gave us all this to do. I have a 3-year-old at home. I have a job. I have other stuff. Like, I don't have time to deal with all of these problems. What I'm happy about is that we've done it when my father is, in his 60s. My great uncle, who does a lot of the farming, is in his 70s. They're around, right? So by doing it earlier, we are able to still lean on that experience. That makes a huge difference in our ability to make decisions, learn more quickly, gain the experiences, and then we still kind of have them as a parachute or a trampoline, if you will, to be able to look to while we're gaining all the experiences that they've had over the last 30 years.
So a lot of things happen on this spot. The end result is that the Confederates failed to take this piece of key terrain. They failed to take the high ground. From here, we're going to leave this location and we're going to examine the situation that faces Lee going into the second day of the battle, July 2nd, and we'll look at it both from Lee's perspective and also what's happening on the Union side. So follow me as we make our way to the next stop.
Farmers have always taken care of what they value. They cultivated bountiful land and fed a nation hungry for progress. As Americans dialed up, precision on the farm led to yields once thought impossible. But when it came to nitrogen, it wasn't precise or predictable enough. Farmers deserve a nitrogen worthy of who they are and what their land can provide. And now there is one.
Right now, we're standing at the position on the Confederate line going into the second day of the battle, which was July 2nd of 1863. It's important to understand why we're standing here and what Robert E. Lee's plan of attack was going into day 2. You'll notice across to your rear, you can see a ridge line quite prominent there, and you'll see a red barn. That red barn is the Cadore barn. Just beyond that, to the left of it, you'll see a domed monument. Roughly in that area, they would have seen on the night of July 1st, Union campfires popped up on the horizon. They stopped in about that vicinity. It was with this information that Lee based his plan. He thinks the Union line stops well short of Little Round Top, the terrain feature you see prominently to the south. So his plan to achieve his ultimate end state was to attack from the south and the north simultaneously. His entire plan is based on the Union position being an area that he hopes and wants and expects it to be. He's going to charge the principal individual with this mission being James Longstreet. Longstreet is reluctant. He doesn't want to launch this attack because he's waiting for additional troops to arrive. He says, I'm going to wait as long as I can. And that's exactly what he does. So Lee's plan, which was to attack simultaneously from the south and the north in a double envelopment or double pincer movement, is going to be unhinged. The northern attack is not going to happen in synchronization with the southern attack. And as a result, Longstreet is going to take 90 minutes to go to the south and then back up. This is an interesting case of looking at a situation, hoping and expecting it to be the way you want it when the reality is quite different.
I think we all have a tendency, based on our experiences, sometimes see the world the way we want to see it versus the way it really is. And yet when I talk to people about confirmation bias, it's always like, oh, that's something that afflicts other people. It would never afflict me. I see reality. And I had a great example one time in a program. A guy was teaching in one of the programs I was running. Imagine 100 bankers in a room, and he says, I'm going to show you 3 playing cards up on a screen, and all you need to do is to tell me what 3 cards you see. Sounds like a pretty simple exercise. Throws them up there, takes them down. He said, what did you see? Almost in unison. 10 of diamonds, king of clubs, jack of hearts. And there's like 2 people are just scratching their head like, something's wrong, I just can't figure out what it is. So he says, you are all absolutely wrong. 10 of diamonds, king of clubs, and a red jack of spades. A lifetime of playing cards told them that if it's a red and it's not a diamond, well, it has to be a heart. Sometimes we are way too slow to adapt because we keep seeing what we want to see. Lee looks out across the field, he sees the campfire starting in a certain place. It fits his narrative around a double envelopment, when in reality, the campfires go the whole way to the base of the other hill. You don't have to change anything. But the idea that somebody out there might be doing something different and maybe better than what you're doing it gets lost if you don't create the opportunity for them to talk to you about it.
So I'd like to give you my example of confirmation bias, or just maybe innovation in which people are hesitant about. My husband and I bought an electric truck last year. As soon as I mention it, or as soon as someone sees it, they immediately scoff it. They immediately think that that's ridiculous. They immediately think it's a fad item. They immediately think that, you know, that can't be useful. That's more of a hindrance than it's worth. And the opposite couldn't be more true. The range is more than enough for all of our farms, which are located between 30 and 50 miles from each other. And I can go back and forth all day with, ironically, hauling the diesel fuel trailer with my electric truck to bring the diesel to the tractors, right?
Yeah, Shannon, we always have a saying that if you're not getting pushback, you're not pioneering. Meaning, when you do stuff like that, people are going to look at you that way. When you start to push the envelope, the people that are entrenched in the current world are going to naturally push back. And I don't mean necessarily always negatively, but that's the price one pays for being out in front a little bit. And you're going to have people guessing and second guessing. But if you're right, and the early adapter status that you've gained by doing that, you get a large head start on other people. That's a great example of not your confirmation bias, but the confirmation bias of all the other people who see it.
On our farm, we just hired a new financial consultant group to come in and look at the different entities, from crop insurance to banking, all entities of the farm, and just have a different view of it. So me as a farmer, I'm not missing something. It's kind of like the military. You get different eye sets on it.
Getting that outside objective perspective is crucial. And tying it back to why we're here at Gettysburg, if you think of it, Lee is coming in, he had a very effective inner circle, a team that was very cohesive, they're aligned in the vision, all those types of things. That team no longer exists, but he's operating as it had been before, like it was the old team. On the other side, we have a brand new commander, brand new to his role, new set, new organization, new set of conditions. He's open to outside opinions. He holds what we call a council of war. He deliberately solicits the feedback of his subordinates, his direct reports. They bring in a different perspective. Together, they come to commitment and see the situation the same way, and they'll be aligned how to proceed, and they're going to set up a defense.
So talking about confirmation bias, as my brother and I started to take over, we're both in our early 30s, the biggest issues we ran into were how to move forward in the way that we wanted to, and also getting buy-in from the older generation. So that is, looks like my dad, my great uncle, people who are in their 60s and 70s who have been doing it the same way. But what my brother and I really sat down and looked at was, how come we're not doing all the fertilizer management and some of the chemical management stuff that everyone is talking about on, podcasts and YouTube videos and things like that. And don't get me wrong, everyone who's doing that is not always right. So it's not always to just go run to the next person who's got the coolest YouTube channel and saying like, this is great and look at my soybeans and all that stuff, right? But my older generation of farmers, one of them genuinely believed that variable rate planting doesn't work. They're like, why? And the way that I was able to get them around to it was to give them the numbers. So we took our prescription seed stuff that we had put together and said, look, let's just assume that the yield's gonna be the same. Should be better, but even so, you're spending less money on seed. For my family, being able to economically show that something is more beneficial is the way to convince them to try something.
From here, we're gonna leave the Confederate positions. We're gonna head over and examine what happens on the Union line and a key decision by one of Meade's subordinate generals, Dan Sickles. Let's go this way. We are now on the Union side. We have moved over. We are on the southern side of the Union defenses. In the location where we are, the Trossel barn to your left, to your front, and you can see this monument here. This monument marks a spot where one of the most notorious figures from the Battle of Gettysburg, General Dan Sickles, was seriously wounded on his horse. So this is actually a monument to a severed limb, which is kind of an interesting thing in its own right. But I want to pick up the discussion and talk about what should have happened and what actually happened. This is the case where the Union commanding general, George Gordon Meade, previously had aligned his organization. His corps commanders, he had met with them and they had agreed that they would hold Cemetery Ridge, that hill mass to your rear. And one of his key corps commanders, Dan Sickles, was supposed to be at the southernmost position linked to Little Round Top. He did not like the position he had been given, though, when he checked the ground, and it's a low ground to your rear beyond that wood line. Repeatedly, he requested permission to press forward to the area you see to your front, and that's known as the Peach Orchard. He thought that was better ground. He spoke with Meade's aide-de-camp. He said he didn't have the authority to grant the permission to move forward. He ended up doing it anyway. So somewhere around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, over 10,000 men of Dan Sickles' corps, without authorization, they moved forward up through this position all the way up to there. General Meade, furious with what was happening, rode forward to confront Sickles for this disobedience of orders. It was in this spot that they had, we can say, a heated conversation. Sickles, with a disrespectful attitude, at one point says to Meade, "Well, do you want me to call my men back?" And it was just at that point that Longstreet, the Confederate Corps commander, had slammed into that, so a battle was underway. Meade said, "Well, I think it's kind of late for that." Sickles, sitting on his horse, is going to be wounded by a cannonball that comes screaming down, hits him in the upper leg. They take him around behind the barn, and he had his leg amputated. So Sickles is often thought of as a renegade, someone who's going to operate in his or her best own interests, regardless of what's good for the organization.
Sometimes there's a fine line between what we like to say being a maverick and being a renegade. What would that look like to you?
I'm trying to determine the difference between arrogance and pride and being trainable. And in a fighter squadron, arrogance is pretty rampant, and in fact, humility is kind of not there. How do you determine a confidence and arrogance versus somebody that's totally in their own self-interest and they're going to be a renegade? Humility among fighter pilots is like virtue among prostitutes. It just isn't there, really.
That's the best stuff I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Is he a renegade or a maverick? That needs to be decided by his boss.
You know, some people operate in their own self-interest first.
But don't you know that? But don't you know that though, as their boss?
Yeah,
and they're that way, and then you make sure you move out of the way, and
yeah, you get rid of them.
Exactly.
You can get rid of them, right? What other options do you have? Do you have any other options?
I think if you go back a little bit further and you look for the people that are going to be more submissive and respect authority, where some people come into an organization, well, that's not how we did it at our last place. This is how we did it. Well, you're at our place now. This is our operation. This is how we want to do it.
But you also have to be cautious about, like, you use the word submissive, and maybe that's not necessarily what you meant. But when we've talked about, like, being approachable and being able to get feedback from your employees, if you have a bunch of employees that are just going to say, like,
yes, yeah,
yep, I'll do whatever you say, like, you have to assume that then you are never going to make any mistakes and never need to be called on your choices, which is a pretty arrogant way of running a business.
Yeah, there's always room for mavericks in organization. They sometimes can be a little more work than the normal people, but they sometimes take you places positively that people who just nod and say, yeah, whatever, don't take you. I think one of the key things to remember, and sometimes we get into discussions here on this subject, that generally when you have a renegade, you have character issues. And character issues travel. So moving them to another place in an organization is just passing on the work that you were supposed to do to another leader. And that's something to remember. If the issue you're having with someone is a competence issue, there are people that can be really good over there doing something and you just have them in the wrong seat on the bus. That's usually the first step to uncover whether you might have a renegade issue, because when you do that and then they step in line, the person maybe didn't have character issues, they just didn't know. They're new to the enterprise. Oh, that's how you do it around here. Character issues are different. Character issues are, here's how we do things around here. And in the back of their mind, they're going, nah, I don't think so. That's not how I fly. That's not how I do things, right? Answer the question in your mind, do I think I have a maverick or a renegade? And what you do after you answer that question is going to determine how you approach the situation, and they should be very, very different.
And so for our purposes, by Sickles taking this unauthorized move forward, he's taken over 10,000 men out of the line that should have protected Little Round Top. He's pressed forward. We now have a big gap in the line that's going to allow men from Longstreet's corps to flow in the direction of Little Round Top. We'll pick up the story and see what Colonel Chamberlain achieves at Little Round Top. Follow me. To our south, Little Round Top is probably one of the most iconic and inspiring stories of any of those that take place at Gettysburg. So here we're going to examine the inspiring example of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the commanding officer of the 20th Maine, who had a heroic defense just south of where we're standing right now on Little Round Top. With a small group of determined soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers, he withstood the repeated assaults from Longstreet's corps that had come in this direction. Again and again, he is confronted with what we could call bad news. The enemy is coming again, and he is progressively getting lower on ammunition. He is suffering more wounded soldiers. And throughout it all, he positions himself, if you think of our phrase, location of a leader, he is very deliberate about where he positions himself and how he reacts to what otherwise would be considered bad news. He brings calm, he brings decisiveness to the situation. And I'm sure many of us can think of situations on the farm or other aspects of life where we've encountered a crisis, and how we can respond to that is going to affect the outcome significantly.
You know, what inspires me about the American farmer and Canadian farmer as well is you take the bad news of weather, you take the bad news of equipment breakdowns, of markets that are going south, and you know, the good leaders take all that with grace and calmness. So just like you to react to that. What happens in your operations when things go completely the opposite direction of what you had planned that day? How do you folks react?
Not nearly that well. We had a great planting season, and all of a sudden, boom, everything come to a halt. We actually broke a hitch on a tractor going through a ditch and dropped the planter, and just about done, and you don't know what is all wrecked. You don't know what's all gonna have to be fixed. As a leader, I probably didn't handle it as well as I should have.
But it just happens. And I'm just as guilty as Chad of being upset, because typically I'm not the one that breaks anything, but then this year was my year to eat crow. I lost a anhydrous tank on the gravel and put a big old dent in our nice 3500, and man, but I'll be darned if they didn't yell at me like I've been yelling at them for the last couple of years. So it's one of those things that, like, it just happens, and it's in our operation, it's like, well, here we are. Like, getting mad about it doesn't unfortunately do any good.
In our family, because we'll have these kind of things happen that we have every year, we're all exhausted and everybody's at wit's end trying to continue. And then somebody will say, you know what we need to do? We just need to go to the diner and have a piece of pie. Mm-hmm. And that visit to there and sitting around having a cup of coffee and pie, believe it or not, makes you calm down, and then you come up with the right idea and you fix it, and the next day you're rolling. It's just farming. Get over it.
I think as you build up your knowledge of your operation, you try to always figure what the solution is going to be, what's going to be next. It could be just getting a piece of pie and let's just figure this out.
Andy, that's a great point. And if you think of this, and perhaps in the context of your lives, he gets this bad news, and you'll see that there's kind of a pause. And it's not that he's zoning out, it's not that he's paralyzed with indecision. He's distancing himself from the chaos of the moment. He's processing, and then he's resolved, and he acts. And it's a tremendous example, I think, for all of us to think about how our actions are going to be contagious in an environment, because others are going to look to us as leaders, how we react to a crisis moment, and then they'll act accordingly. So if we are calm, if we bring decision and decisiveness, others will do the same. If we lose control, if we express despair, if we're chaotic, that's also going to cascade throughout the organization.
Yeah, I'd like to make the point that the battle on Little Round Top with Chamberlain was won in the 5 weeks leading up to that. You know, we get so fixated on the end sometimes, what happened there. We lose sight of all the things that happened leading up to that prepared that group to win there. And I don't think it's probably a whole lot different than what you're doing, right? You've got your group ready for the big seasons, whether it's getting the crop out, whether it's getting it in, and preparing everybody for those things. And the camaraderie that comes out of that preparation stands by you when stuff inevitably is going to go bad, and you rally around that stuff. And I think it's an interesting learning here that I'll bet you can look back and go, you know, we pulled together and got through that, not because of that moment as much as it was all the things that led up to that got people in the right frame of mind to handle the adversity or the setback the right way, so that you see the other side of it.
Exactly. So one of the key moments that you mentioned, how you deal with that, is when we find that Chamberlain is presented with 120 soldiers. These soldiers have refused to fight. They failed to read the fine print, if you will, on their enlistment documents. They thought they had signed up for 2 years when in fact they had signed up for 3. So they are delivered under armed guard, under the threat of execution to Chamberlain. What's he going to do with them? He needs this manpower because his unit is already woefully under strength. And the way he deals with them is being an authentic servant leader. He appeals to what they have in common. He recognizes the diversity in their backgrounds, maybe the reasons why they've come. And in so doing, by being an authentic servant leader, he gains that connection. People are going to respond to you when you deal with them in a human way, in a humble way, in an authentic way, rather than just pulling rank or authority or the grievance, whatever the case might be.
Seems like if you're more calm in the cattle industry, you save more time.
But that's my wife's
slower
whole
is faster. But when you're younger, that doesn't seem to come out that way.
Now, we talk a lot about this idea that elite performers defeat fear. Keeping people calm, even though it's a tight spot, right? It's you know, a mission that you guys have been on before, and the very best, they just seem to perform the best when it matters the most. And a lot of that is from having been through it, reflecting on it a little bit. Next time it comes around, everything slows down a little bit for you. You're a little bit further down the path some, and I believe that plays out in your everyday lives as well.
What resonated with me on that conversation was the calmer heads seemed to come up with better, quicker solutions. A lot of people think being calm, cool, and collect, they think, well, that takes time, where I think a lot of times being calmer, thinking things through, is better than it would be just going right at it. Shooting on the marksmanship team, there's some scenarios where it's pretty quick, but the saying was always still, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And it's true then and it's true today.
Okay, right now we are standing at the spot known as the high water mark. This is also known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. We've just come across the field following the route of Pickett's charge. This was Lee's last-ditch attempt really to bring victory here at Gettysburg on the afternoon of July 3rd. We've just witnessed the greatest artillery bombardment ever to take place in North America. Despite all of the preparation and the massive firepower, it was for naught. In this spot where we are now, fewer than 100 Confederates actually penetrated the Union line. Meade had been brilliant, reallocating troops, artillery, so that when the Confederates finally made it to just within a few hundred yards of their destination, they were raked down by massive murderous musket fire coupled with artillery. When the attack failed, the remnants of Longstreet's corps made their way back. Lee was there waiting for them. He took full personal accountability. He said, "It's all my fault. It's all my fault." From there, the Confederates would make the long, slow, painful retreat to the safety of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia.
Gettysburg was Lee's greatest opportunity, turned out to be his greatest defeat. And yet, with all that said, he took accountability. And so I guess my question for you, and I know we have a lot of family operations, what does accountability look like within a family business when something doesn't go exactly the right way? How does that manifest itself in a family business?
It's a lot easier to be an upset leader or member of a team when you don't know whose fault it was. You know, you're like, who did that? I'm upset about that, whatever it is. But I would say generally in our family, whoever does it is like, oh, I did that. And then now you're actually confronted with talking to that person, and they're a person too, right? And you just realize that, you know, mistakes happen. Usually your hardest critic is yourself.
Mm-hmm. It's also communicating a culture when the leader says, "Hey, I really messed up here. It was my fault." And that communicates a culture that it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to come forward on that. Let's correct the mistake. We aren't interested in blame. We're interested in correcting the mistake and setting procedures in place so that it doesn't happen again and make it a learning opportunity.
I think a key point you said, Chuck, is in Scott and Shannon are saying the same thing, is you own it. I mean, just like Lee did, that's what a leader has to do, is like, you know, I messed up, I should have done this, please forgive me. I mean, you got to move on.
Final thing. The day after this big Union victory, this is the first time that Lee has been beaten in the Civil War. The day after, the fortress at Vicksburg will fall. And the architect of that victory was Ulysses S. Grant. At long last, Abraham Lincoln has his closer. He has a general that understands what it takes to win and will stop at nothing to achieve final victory. So the following year, in 1864, Lincoln is going to promote Grant to become general of the armies. He's going to move him to the Eastern Theater, and Grant is going to build his team with the likes of Sherman and Sheridan, and together they will bring ultimate victory to the Union cause.
The American Civil War would carry on for nearly 2 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, with the North's final victory bringing an eventual end to slavery in the United States. 4.5 months after General Meade's triumph in Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln spoke at the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery, delivering one of the most famous speeches in American history. In just 271 words, the Gettysburg Address is a powerful reminder of the values and purpose for which so many gave their lives.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we have increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of this nation, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth.